Good afternoon to all watching us live on Facebook. This is the University of the Virgin Islands WVI radio production class giving their last presentation for the semester. This is the University of the Virgin Islands radio production class celebrating Hubert Harrison. And we're doing this through some interactive games that the students worked on, some audio presentations, video presentations, actual visual presentations that they created, as well as an interview with Dr. Jeffrey Perry. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kahina for a quick moment, and then we will let the students go ahead and take it away.
And greetings, everyone, and welcome to another live broadcast made possible in part through WUVI Radio, along with the Communication Programs course. This is a radio production course, and these students have spent some quality time doing research around a variety of themes. And with April 27th, marking the anniversary of the birth of the Honorable Outstanding Virgin Islander Hubert Harrison, this gives us an opportunity for them to not only engage in sharing interactive games, as mentioned by my colleague, Professor Dar M. Cooper, it gives us an opportunity for the students to add some critical thoughts and critical engagement around the conversations of all things Hubert Harrison. They also have the joy and privilege of having the expertise of one of the world-renowned historians, scholars, and of course, researchers, among other things, in the embodiment of Dr. Jeffrey Perry, who has written a host of publications around the life, the achievements, the contributions of Hubert Harrison. And we'll do a more formal introduction of Dr. Perry a little later in the broadcast. And with that, I turn it over to our UVI comm student moderator, Ms. Shari Lewis.
Hey, yay! Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to WUVI 97.3 FM, student radio station of the Virgin Islands. I am Shari Lewis, your host today, and joined with me are my fellow co-hosts, Michael Bell, Sequana Smith. Just do a little wave. Mike Bell, Sequana Smith, Amos Francis, Araya Farron, and Kiana Jacobs. All right, and we are the students of the radio production class at the University of the Virgin Islands. And today, as we celebrate the life of Hubert Harrison, we will be conducting a live interview with Dr. Jeffrey B. Perry, who is an archivist and a historian. He is also a biographer of Hubert Harrison and will be able to provide us with further information on the life of Hubert Harrison. And so before we do this, let us take a minute and have a little fun as we go into a little Kahoot game. So I will ask Kiana to go ahead and share it with us.
And actually, we'll just have all of the students play. So the pin for Kahoot is in the chat. If anybody wants to join along with us on Facebook, you can. The pin is 317-8811. 317-8811. So if you could go ahead and join us in the Kahoot game. I'm going to share our screen in a second so that you can see. And the Kahoot game, again, was made by the students, just to make a little educational entertainment to learn a little bit more about Hubert Harrison. And I see everyone coming in, so I'm going to share the screen now so that you can see them as well. We have, there we go. We have Mike, Sherry, Dr. Chen. I will put mine in as well. And for those that aren't familiar with Kahoot, it's one of the many different tools that you can use to have a little fun with education as opposed to just lecture style. All right, so it's going to go ahead and start. Here we go. And I'll read out the questions. All right, who was Harrison's Crucian labor leader, lifelong friend? James Canegata, Rothschild Francis, Cyril E. King, D. Hamilton Jackson. So those are the options. And the question again was, who was Harrison's Crucian labor leader and lifelong friend? D. Hamilton Jackson. Okay. So Sequana is in the lead, Amos trailing her closely, and the rest of us following behind. Question 2, and this is going to be 4 questions. So which movement was Hubert Harrison's first newspaper of race conscious under? New Negro Movement, Black Lives Matter Movement, Me Too Movement, World War II. So which movement? His first newspaper of race consciousness. Let's see what the answers are. The New Negro Movement. Okay, everybody got that one right. Amos took the lead from Sequana. Ms. Lewis following close. Question number 3. Harrison was an early supporter of the protest philosophies of William Monroe Trotter and, who's the other person? W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, Martin Luther King, Donald Trump. Harrison was an early supporter of the protest philosophies of William Monroe Trotter and W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, Martin Luther King, or Donald Trump. All right. So we got a change now, a major change with Mike coming in the lead. Last question. Harrison's first of many published letters to the editor appeared in the blank in 1903. So his first of many published letters to the editor in 1903 appeared where? Washington Times, Daily News, New York Times, or the St. Croix Avis? The Washington Times, the Daily News, the New York Times, or the St. Croix Avis? Aha. New York Times is what everybody selected. So Mike is in the lead with Kiana Jacobs coming in next and Sequana. So we're going to stop there for that game. Thank you, students, for putting that together. You all seem to know a lot about Hubert Harrison, so let's see what else we have. And we're going to start with some presentations.
Okay, just give yourself a big hand. We are knowledgeable today on Hubert Harrison. So let's go ahead and start with Mike Bell as he presents to us his findings on Hubert Harrison.
Thank you so much, Sherry. Good afternoon, everybody. My name again is Michael Bell, a sophomore here at the Albert Einstein campus at the University of Virgin Islands, and this is my presentation on Hubert Harrison. The Black Socrates, Hubert Harrison. Of course, who was he? Hubert Harrison was and is one of the most America's greatest minds. He's referred to by peers as the Black Socrates. He's known as the father of Black radicalism. He's influenced by other radical leaders, was stretched to Marcus Garvey and A. Philip Rudolph. He's the editor of the Negro World publication, Black leader of the Socialist Party in New York, and leader of the New Negro movement. Early life, he was born April 27th of 1883 to Cecilia Elizabeth Haynes, and his father was Adolphus Harrison. Born in Concordia, St. Croix in the Danish West Indies, excelled academically. The Revolutionary's journey. Moved to New York in the 1900s after his mother's death. Lived with his sister Mary in Lower Manhattan. Attended night school and worked as an elevator operator during the day, and broke away from Christianity around 1901. A journey of a revolutionary. In his first decade in New York, Harrison started writing letters to the editor of the New York Times on topics such as lynching, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, and literary criticism. He also began lecturing on such subjects as the poetry of Paul Laurence Dunbar and Reconstruction. Harrison also became interested in the free thought movement, which encouraged use of scientific method, epicureanism and reason, and thinking devoted to theistic dogma. In 1907, Harrison obtained the job at the United States Post Office. Harrison was an early supporter of the protest philosophies of W.E.B. Du Bois and William Monroe Trotter. Particularly after the Brownsville affair, he became an outspoken critic of President Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, and of the Republican Party. He also criticized the prominent Black leader, Booker T. Washington, whose political philosophy Harrison considered subservient. In 1910, Harrison wrote 2 letters to the New York Sun and was criticized with the statements by Washington. Harrison lost his postal employment through the efforts of Washington's powerful Tuskegee machine. Socialism. In 1911, after his postal firing, Harrison began working full-time with the Socialist Party of America. He became America's leading Black socialist. He lectured widely against capitalism, campaigned for parties for presidential candidate Eugene V. Debs in 1912, and founded the Colored Socialist Club, the socialists' first effort at reaching African Americans. He developed 2 important and pioneering theoretical series on the Negro and socialism for the socialist newspaper, the New York Call, and for the socialist monthly, International Socialist Review. In conclusion, for many years after his death in 1927, Harrison was much neglected. However, recent scholarships on Harrison's life and the Columbia University Library's acquisition of his papers show renewed interest. Acquisitions of the Herbert H. Harrison papers and publishing of the Herbert H. Harrison papers 1893 to 1927 finding aid. Biographer Jeffrey P. Perry writes that among the African American leaders of his era, Harrison was the most class-conscious of racial radicals and the most race-conscious of the class radicals. Perry emphasized that Harrison was a unifying figure between 2 major trends of African American struggle, the labor and civil rights trend, identified with Randolph and Owen and later with Martin Luther King, and the race and nationalist trend identified with Garvey and later with Malcolm X. He has also been described as the most distinguished, if not the most well-known, Caribbean radical in the United States in the early 20th century by historian Winston James. So this has been my small presentation on Hubert Harrison. And now I will turn it back over to my cohort, Sherry.
Thank you, Mike. That was quite informative. And we're going to go right ahead with Kiana. Are you ready to present? I'm sorry. Sorry, Kiana. This should be Sequana that is going to present. So let's do a little, see some hands for Kiana.
Hubert Harrison was born in St. Croix, Danish West Indies in 1883. Mr. Harrison made his mark in the United States by struggling against class and racial oppression, by helping to create a remarkably rich and vibrant intellectual life among African Americans, and by working for the enlightened development of the lives of common people. He consistently emphasized the need for working class people to develop class consciousness, for Negroes to develop race consciousness, self-reliance, and self-respect, and for all those he reached to challenge white supremacy and develop modern scientific, critical, and independent thought as means toward liberation. After publishing a few of his works, one being When Africa Awaits in 1920, Mr. Harrison died on December 17, 1927 in Bellevue Hospital in New York while undergoing appendectomy. Show me a population that is deeply religious, and I will show you a survived population, content with whips and chains, content to eat the bread of sorrow and drink the waters of affliction. Hubert Harrison. Hubert Harrison was born in
No, 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 no. It's gonna come back. Come on. Come on.
We can keep it moving.
That was good, pretty good. Let's give Sequana another big hand. So what I noticed is that everyone had so much information that I would practically be repeating some of the things. So I'm gonna share my slide, but I want to do a little fast forward. Let me hit share. All right, everyone can see it? Thumbs up. All right, so we already covered his birthday, all that he did, but I want to fast forward to something. Here we go. This is it. I'm going to read this out, okay? And this was said by Hubert Harrison back in 1917. He said, "The world of the future will look upon the world of today as an essentially new turning point in the path of human progress. All over the world, the spirit of democratic striving is making itself felt. The new issues have brought forth new ideas of freedom, politics, industry, and society at large. The new Negro living in this new world is just as responsive to these new impulses as other people are." And I feel as if this is just so significant in today's time, where today's climate, the society that we live in, the political climate that we're in, the economical climate that we're in. And I'm wondering, it's almost as if his spirit is speaking directly to us and asking, how responsive are we, or how conscious are we in the climate that we are in? And so this is my takeaway from everything that we have presented. This is what I want to show you. Now, we're going to go to, let me stop sharing. Oh boy. We're going to go over to our guest speaker, who is just sitting back, relaxed, and just enjoying the presentation. And I know that he has more to add. So we're going to start by asking Dr. Jeffrey Perry some questions. He is the biographer of Hubert Harrison, so he is well informed. And we want to ask you, Dr. Perry, tell us about your book, Hubert Harrison, The Struggle for Equality. Give us some background information. Tell us more about your book.
Okay, well, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, it's the second volume of my biography of Hubert Harrison. First volume, I think it looks like you've all read, Hubert Harrison, The Voice of Harlem Radicalism. And these two volumes together, I believe, are the first full-length multi-volume biography of an Afro-Caribbean, and only the fourth of an African-American, after those of Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Langston Hughes. Hubert Harrison from St. Croix near the Salt River is a giant of Black and Afro-Caribbean history. And I'm so pleased to see you all picking up on his work and his life and learning about it, but spreading it. And for 40 years I've worked on this, and it was written for those who will come after me, a lot of my work. And so this is very exhilarating. When he dies, Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, who is a major bibliophile of the Black experience in New York and has the major library in New York called the Schomburg Center, named after him. And Harrison and Schomburg were on the founding committees of that. Delivered one of the eulogies at his funeral. And people may not be aware, but Schomburg, although he's born in Puerto Rico, his mother came from St. Croix also, and she was a Francis, right? And so he delivers the eulogy, and one of the things he says, he knew how popular Harrison was in his day, but he says Hubert Harrison was ahead of his time. And that's why what you're pointing out, Sherry, I think is very true. He's speaking to people today if they get through it. Now, in this second volume in particular, I cover the last 8.5 years of his life, but it's a big book. I don't know if you can see it here. It's, I'll pull it over in a second. It's 1,000 pages. And it's broken into 4 sections, one on the New Negro movement, because that's where the first volume ends. And it talks about his editing a publication called The New Negro, and then his editing Marcus Garvey's New Negro World. Then it moves into some debates he has with other radical activists. And then it moves on to his freelance educational work. And finally, his last years with the International Colored Unity League. Now, a couple of things I did in this second volume that I think are important as a biographer. One, in the footnotes, I tried wherever I could to put links to online sources. So for instance, if Harrison is doing a book review from 1922, I will try to link not only to Harrison's book review, but to the book he's reading. As was mentioned earlier, back in 2005, I placed his papers, which I got from his son and daughter back in 1981, and I spent years transcribing them and archiving them and preserving them while I was a soccer dad, all these things, working and a soccer dad and doing all those things, and earning my degrees. And in 2005, Harrison's grandson said, "Jeff, let's place them." And we wound up, for family reasons, placing them at Columbia University. It's a major collection of over 100 boxes like these archival boxes. But when we placed them, part of the agreement was they would digitize a good quantity of them. And last year, they digitized 1,300 items. So these are freely available online to you at your computer. And you simply go to the Columbia University Rare Book and Manuscript Library, Hubert H. Harrison Digital Collection, and you can read his whole diary. It's staggering. And I didn't get that. I had written a dissertation, a PhD dissertation of 812 pages. And then his daughter and I went out, she was 75, we went out for some dinner. She goes, "Oh, here, I have one more thing for you." And she gave me his diary. I couldn't believe it, So, I knew I just had to keep doing what I was doing. And as I wrote the biography, I tried to, thank you very much, this is great, Ollie. I tried to be faithful to Harrison, and I tried to follow some little insights that Harrison offered in his diary and elsewhere. When he started his diary, he goes, "I'm going to write things as they happen. I'm not going to try and glorify myself or, enrich myself, because, I can learn from it and others." He thought others would read his diary afterwards. And he goes, "But it's also, if I put it down now and I look on it later in later years, some things will loom large and others will recede in importance." He had a great historical perspective. And I took from that, and from J.A. Rogers. Rogers said another very important thing, besides describing Harrison as perhaps the foremost Afro-American intellect of his era, right? That's what he said in his book, World's Great Men of Color. And that's between chapters on Booker T. Washington, Du Bois, and Marcus Garvey. So J.A. Rogers is extending the highest praise to Harrison. But he says, "No man is perfect to his valet." And then he goes, "And that was certainly the case, with Hubert Harrison. But that does not detract from his essential greatness." And so I try and tell, Harrison's story completely, because there's much to learn in all the different aspects of Harrison. But other things that people may not be familiar with, because some of the conversation was on Harrison's radical activities, but he was the first regular Black book reviewer. You hear this? He started the West Indian News Notes section in Marcus Garvey's Negro World. He started in all his publications. He had poetry for the people. He interacted with the artists. He regularly did book reviews almost his entire life. He was a brilliant soapbox orator. While Harrison was alive, the two main ways of reaching what he referred to as affection as the common people, the masses, the two main ways of reaching them were through public speaking and newspapers. And he was brilliant at both. And so I try and put all that into the picture, and hopefully people can draw from that. But other things I do in the book, and this I hope this group in particular will appreciate. I hope you're able to get both a print copy at least, and maybe an ebook copy for the university, right? Is I try to make it a point wherever he's having meetings with the Virgin Island Protective Association, these groups in New York, right? To list some of the activists who were involved, because I've had people come up to me and say, that's my grandmother. It's nice to see those ties and those connections. Yeah. And it's the kind of thing, as evidenced by what you're doing here today, that people can take and build off and develop. There's so many ways to take Harrison. And that's when I wrote the book, that's what I was hoping, that I would provide lots of information. He stands on his own. He's incredibly important. But there's so many ways people can build off that and take it to a higher level. What he says is relevant, totally relevant today, because as his daughter told me, she goes, Jeff, remember, he never backed off the fight against white supremacy, which is very important even today, as we know. So he was class conscious, he was race conscious, he was an internationalist, a radical internationalist. And Richard B. Moore, one of his contemporaries and another outstanding Afro-Caribbean activist, emphasizes that in a piece he did on Harrison. And one thing I found of interest recently was in the past year, I was contacted by the Encyclopedia of Barbadian Biography, and they want to include Harrison in it now because his mom's from Barbados. She was an immigrant plantation worker on Concordia from Barbados, and his biological father, the plantation worker in St. Croix. So Harrison had his St. Croix roots play a very important part in his development. And if you read volume 1, you might be familiar with this, but he lives in total poverty, as he does most of his life. But first off, he's living in kind of an immigrant and a native-born population. So he's exposed to, he has a little breadth of the experience of the people he's in contact with. When he moves, he moves from Concordia to the Watergut section of Christiansted, right? Very poor area. And he accesses the Protestant, St. John's Protestant Episcopal Church in Christiansted. I believe that's the one right there. And the Reverend would let him go in and use the library all the time. So he was reading all the time. You mentioned D. Hamilton Jackson being a lifelong friend of his, but Harrison was also influenced by Wilford Jackson. That's the father of D. Hamilton Jackson, who was considered the best teacher, black or white, as the saying went, on the island. He's very good. So Harrison took advantage of all these things. And when he came up to New York, he also was aware of the rich Caribbean, rich Crucian history of struggle. And that's from the 1848 emancipation to 1878 and 1879, and Queen Mary, you know,
Yeah.
all these important things in your history, and it influences him and shapes him. And when he comes to New York, he brings all of that. And but he also, in St. Croix, he grows with the belief that he's the equal of anybody else, because back then the racism was not as vicious and as virulent as in the US. When Harrison comes to New York in 1900, he's shocked. Someone mentioned his early writings in the New York Times. One of the very first one was on lynching. And he writes, I was utterly shocked by what I saw and read. And Marcus Garvey says the same thing when he comes from Jamaica. Claude McKay from Jamaica says the same thing. He says, I had heard about the virulence of race prejudice, or I had heard about the race prejudice in United States, but I never believed it would be so virulent. So there was a significant difference. And this, Harrison had the opportunity to educate himself and learn, which was not afforded to many people, many Black people down south in the US. So he came, as did other Afro-Caribbeans, right? And they, took leadership in oftentimes in various organizations. Another little anecdotal thing, since I see the makeup of the class and the teachers, when Harrison came to New York in 1900, he followed in the path of his older sister. And that was very much a pattern in that early period, that oftentimes it would be the female member of the family who would come first and pave the way for others. So it's all very interesting. I think of lots of different things when I think of Harrison's Crucian years and how they still influenced him later. And of course, he was active in New York with Ashley Totten, Elizabeth Hendrickson, Casper Holstein. You may know some of these names. And the Hamilton Jackson came up. And I think Harrison and Hamilton exchanged outlines for the organization that Jackson would build back in St. Croix, so.
Thank you, Dr. Perry. So we are here with WUVI Radio, and we know that others are joining us right about now. So we want to welcome Dr. Perry again to our broadcasting live on Facebook. And Dr. Perry, can you tell us a bit more about yourself? We know that you're an archivist, you're a biographer. Is there anything else that we have missed? Tell us more about yourself.
Well, my roots are entirely working class. I was born in the Bronx, New York. Nobody in my family had ever gone to college. Like Harrison, nobody had gone to college. And I did get to go to college. He never was able to. And I went to good schools. I went to Princeton, Harvard, all these schools. But again, with no money and no experience in that background. But I went to school, but I grew up in the 60s. So I was influenced by all the radicalism of the civil rights movement and the women's movement and the Students for a Democratic Society, all of that. I was early active in those things. I resisted the Vietnam War, faced going to jail a la Muhammad Ali, right? Right, Muhammad Ali, is that who it was back then? Yeah. And I did that. I did volunteer work with the Black Panthers. I did work with the Puerto Rican Socialist Party in New York for 3 or 4 years. I traveled. When I dropped out of graduate school for a period, I had no money. I never had money in my life, but I traveled by land all the way to Argentina and back, $300 for 3 months, $1 a day in pensions, talking to people like we're doing here. And you learn a lot when you talk to people. Passed through Trinidad, Barbados on the way back. And even in these travels, little things you pick up. I remember so much in my life. In Trinidad, I was 10 miles outside Port of Spain, and sometimes I'd walk into the capital and I'd be on the main road and stick out my thumb, see if I can get a ride. But as you're walking down the road and you're passing somebody, people would say, good morning. And, it's just that attitude, it's so human and so friendly, and it stayed with me the rest of my life. I mean, I guess, weird anecdotes, but so I was very active. I was an activist, and then I went into the labor movement because at a certain point, after I was doing work with the Puerto Rican socialist for a while. Oh, and my wife is active in the Asian American movement because she's been way back, you know, and so I had exposure to all of these different movements. And at a certain point in the early 70s, I became convinced my major responsibility was to go into the workplace and try and organize amongst European American workers on the fighting, not only, but to really go after that struggle against white supremacy amongst them. I felt it was a special responsibility. And I did that for 32, 33 years. And we built wonderful movements, placing the struggle against white supremacy as central to all struggles of our labor movement and our working class. We also coordinated statewide anti-apartheid. We did lots of wonderful things. And then along the way, I was also influenced. And if you go to my webpage, I hope you do, www.jeffreybperry.net.
I did.
Yeah, if you go to my webpage, the other person who influenced me besides Hubert Harrison, and you have to understand, I've been having conversations with Hubert Harrison for 40 years now. You read his diary over and over again, you feel like you know him a little bit, is a fellow named Theodore W. Allen, who was another autodidact like Hubert Harrison, self-educated, and a former coal miner. And he pioneered class struggle-based white skin privilege analysis back in the 1960s. It's a much deeper analysis than a lot of what you see out there today. But he also wrote 2 volumes, which I edited the new versions of, on the invention of the white race. It's a history most people aren't familiar with. It talks about 17th century Virginia and how things got set up. He wrote it for Verso Books, which is a British publisher, both in England and in New York. And within another month, I'm going to be finishing up yet a 3rd edition for those of that, the invention of the white race. So it's a pretty full plate. But so I work on Harrison, I work on Allen, and I was an activist and I'm an archivist. I have in my house, I have about, let me just get rid of this. I don't know how to get rid of it, but I have about 750 archival boxes and 7,500 books, mostly on race and class.
What you have there, Dr. Perry, is a treasure chest, and we are honored that you're here with us to tell us more about the Hubert Harrison. You mentioned something about autodidact. I hope
Yes.
I'm pronouncing it right.
Yes.
Can you describe or briefly share that part that Hubert Harrison took in being an autodidact? And are you an autodidact yourself?
Well, of sorts, although I went to schools, but a lot of my work has gone on. I consider myself a bit of an autodidact because I continued my education on my own. And that's when I think I got my best education. I remember when I finished college, I used to go, I'd had access to the university library like you all might have. And I went down into the bowels of the library and poured through the open stacks as my interests were aroused. And I read and read. But an autodidact is a self-educated, self-taught person. And that's what Harrison was and what Allen was. And there's a very good historian who's written on this, on autodidacts. And he says sometimes, he doesn't go broadly and say every case, but he says sometimes the autodidacts see what's going on in their world much more clearly than those who are in the academy, if you will, those who are teaching, because they're more in touch with the regular people and the real events and things like that. And I think that was definitely the case with Harrison, because when he moves to New York, Harrison, he moves to join his sister in the West 60s at first, West 62nd Street, which was the main area of African-American and Afro-Caribbean population up until the completion of the IRT subway in 1904, which went up to Harlem. And then when he moves to Harlem, he lives at 231 West 134th Street. It's the most densely populated block in Harlem. So Hubert Harrison is always amongst the people. Also at that Schomburg Center, which Harrison helped to build, the librarian there said that there was no one who ever read more books or borrowed more books from that public library than Hubert Harrison. And he said free public libraries are one of the great institutions in this country, he's referring to the US, but I think in the world, where people can go and get access to learning and knowledge. And that's why even with my books, if people can't afford them, I encourage people to talk to their public libraries and their college and university libraries and try and get the books placed there, wherever, or if you have relatives, have them do that.
Thank you, Dr. Perry. Go ahead, Kiana.
Good afternoon, Dr. Perry.
Hello.
I have a few questions to ask you.
Okay.
How long does it take you to write a book?
Well, I started, some people can turn them out pretty quickly. Few years, a scholarly book, what's called a scholarly book. If you're thinking of finishing college, maybe going to graduate work, 3, 4, 5 years. But my path was a bit different because I was working full-time in the post office. I was the head of a 4,000 worker facility, and we were very militant. And I thought, gee, it doesn't get much better than this. We were really fighting what I called the good fight, against white supremacy and things like that. But also, I chose a different route. When I spoke with Harrison's daughter, she said, Jeff, why don't you write a simple biography of my father? And I listened, and I respected her very much. She's the first picture inside volume 2 of the biography. But I said, I just got to do this because I've got all this material and his story needs to be told and preserved for future generations. So that's what I set about doing. So I finished that first volume in 1987 for my PhD dissertation at Columbia University. It was 812 pages. This is after I started in 1981. And I had outstanding advisors, Nathan Huggins, who went up to Harvard and headed the Du Bois Institute, and Hollis Lynch, who's from Trinidad and Tobago, actually from Tobago. And they said, Jeff, end it here. Let's go. Let's move on. And so I submitted my book to various university presses. First one I went to, they said they wanted to publish it. But then as it went through their review process, they almost died because I'm sending them 800 pages and they're saying, who's Hubert Harrison and who are you? They couldn't understand it. But I was undaunted. And because I didn't see, but I heard from people, all the reviews were outstanding, really outstanding by the readers. You have to have these books reviewed. So I went for 10 to 15 years trying to get a contract for a 2-volume biography of Hubert Harrison. And in the interim, after I did the 812 pages, is when Harrison's daughter gave me his diary, which I didn't know existed, as I mentioned. And I knew I had 2 volumes. So I went undaunted for 12, 13, 14 years until I was able to get a contract at Columbia University Press for the 2-volume biography. And when I went there, their publisher, very knowledgeable on both Hubert Harrison and Theodore W. Allen, the 2 people I write about. And he was senior editor at the time at Columbia and had been senior editor at Random House. And he said to me, and he was right on the mark with this, he says, Jeff, you realize 95% of the historians out there don't know who Hubert Harrison or Theodore W. Allen are. And of those who do, 95% feel threatened by their work, because it poses a challenge to everything they've done. If you're a historian and you've been writing for 30 years and you don't mention Hubert Harrison, you got some explaining to do. How do you explain that? And I could go into that in much greater depth with specifics, but I thought that was a good question. So my route, and in between, I also did 2 volumes of The Invention of the What. The other books I did, in case people are not aware, besides the 2-volume Harrison biography, that's volume 1, if you can see it, that's the father of Harlem radicalism. And this is the, too heavy, struggle for equality. But I also did, and this is very important, and I think you have it down there, a Hubert Harrison Reader, which is Wesleyan University Press. This was done by Diasporic Africa Press, a nice publishing house out of Brooklyn. And it's a reprint of Hubert Harrison's When Africa Awakes, which, by the way, is subtitled The Inside Story of the Stirrings and Strivings of the New Negro in the Western World. This book has 53 articles, and I say the title because Harrison's the founder of the first newspaper of the New Negro movement, The Voice, in 1917. He edits in 1919 The New Negro, and in 1920 he writes this book, which is the inside story. And it's not until 1925 till Alain Leroy Locke comes out with a book entitled The New Negro, right? And for many years, for almost 80 years or something, whenever there was talk of the New Negro, it was a literary movement. But Harrison's New Negro movement was literary, but it was also political. So he was written out of that, and that it's important to reshape that understanding, and that is happening now, because within the last year or so, at the Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C., the big national museum, they finally, on their wall on the New Negro, they have two people. They have Alain Leroy Locke and Hubert Harrison. So, and I'm hoping with your generation down the road, maybe there'll be some commemoration in St. Croix for Hubert Harrison, because we have people up in Harlem talking again about commemorating streets or something. We just had recently, I did a talk about 2 weeks ago, and they want to start putting a marker there. We had a community board unanimous vote to name a street after Hubert Harrison, but nothing happened on it at the time. But I think it's appropriate in both places.
I'm ready to start in a star in a movie for him. So if you're ready for
I will help with the background, but you got a good filmmaker down there. Who's going to do it?
We have to work on it, Dr. Perry. We have to work
I've got some names, and that would be great. And I think all of you, everybody could play a part.
Definitely. Go ahead, Mike. You'll have a starring role, Mike. Go ahead.
Okay, so my question is the basis. Many have called Hubert Harrison a fanatic. Some have said he's a little crazy. You said he was ahead of his time. I want to know, with all these labels, what should people most recognize Hubert Harrison for, since he's not that well celebrated and he's almost sometimes forgotten?
I know that review that you read. But I appreciated him doing that review, and he threw it out there. But I don't think, I thought he said many good points in that review, if we're talking about the same review. But I don't think Harrison is a fanatic or anything like that. I think he really spoke his mind, for the most part, in the intellectual and political arena. And it takes great integrity to do that. It's oftentimes, it hurts you financially, it hurts you politically. He had integrity, intellectual integrity. And that's part of the appeal of Harrison to me. And again, as I said, he's not perfect, but so, and even in his personal life, he's not perfect. And I go through this in there. But I'll also say many of the other leaders of the era were not perfect, which I'm familiar with their backgrounds and histories. So, but Harrison was also, he was open to different things. For instance, he goes to a gay ball in Harlem in 1927. He says, I had the time of my life there. It's unusual. It was a little striking, when I first read it. And he talks about marriage at different stages in people's lives and how that works. He explores all these different areas. But in terms of his criticism, I think it's important also to look at the people he criticized and what his criticisms of them were. For instance, he criticized Booker T. Washington for being one who was just, would bow to the interest of the elite. Harrison had scrapbooks, and the leading person in his scrapbooks on subservience was Booker T. Washington. And that's how Harrison got fired from the post office, because Booker T. Washington goes to England in 1910 and says things are basically fine back home. W.E.B. Du Bois gets together 50 people, writes a letter of protest, and Harrison from the post office writes 2 letters to a New York paper saying, Booker T, you're free to say what you want, but you should tell the truth. And Harrison was summarily fired from the post office. Being a postal worker, I know how to get his postal records. He had a clean record. He hadn't done anything wrong. And then he's all of a sudden fired, which was devastating because he'd have a wife and ultimately 5 children. When he criticizes Du Bois in 1918, around the time of World War I. And this is important to know. Woodrow Wilson leads the US into World War I to, quote, make the world safe for democracy. Harrison calls a rally on 132nd Street in Harlem, and he says, let's make the South safe for democracy, because he doesn't believe all Wilson's statements. And he has there Adam Clayton Powell Sr., and he invites up to the stage a young Marcus Garvey also, right? And they speak, and but what happens is then he and William Monroe Trotter plan to convene a Liberty Congress in Washington, D.C. to protest World War I and to demand 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments be enforced and federal anti-lynching legislation. Now, at that time, the NAACP in the early years never had a black head. The head was a fellow named Joel E. Spingarn from Columbia University, who they still give their Outstanding Achievement Award for a Black American in his name. And Spingarn was a major in military intelligence. That's that branch of the government that monitors the Black and the radical community. He was also, by W.E.B. Du Bois's own acknowledgement, Du Bois's closest white friend. He would help Du Bois with finances and things like this. And he tried to talk Trotter into calling it off. He wouldn't even waste time trying to talk to Harrison, and he got nowhere. So Harrison and Trotter convened this meeting with 100 and some odd people, which is what's on the cover of the first volume. You can't see the whole picture, but the picture's inside. And that's when Harrison's sitting there with his arms crossed. He's pretty serious, right? And so what happens is then W.E.B. Du Bois, following the lead of Spingarn, I'm not going to say that Spingarn talked him into it. Du Bois makes his own decisions, but he wrote an editorial in the Crisis magazine, which was the paper of the NAACP that Du Bois edited, and it's entitled Close Ranks. It's only 1 paragraph long, and it was the editorial he was most embarrassed about in his whole life. And he writes, while this war lasts, let us forget our special grievances and close ranks behind Woodrow Wilson's war effort. Now, what were the special grievances? Lynching, segregation, and disfranchisement. And Harrison took Du Bois to task for that publicly. And he basically said, look, we can disagree on the war, but you don't have to take it that far. And he exposed that. And Du Bois would really never speak to Harrison again, ever after that. But what's very interesting, and I have this in volume 2 also, Herbert Aptheker, who's the chronicler of the life of Du Bois, comments that some 40 years later, W.E.B. Du Bois recognized the correctness of his critics during World War I, principally Harrison. So in answer to, I'm coming back, Mike, to what you raised, I think his criticisms were often on mark. It wasn't like they were just being spiteful or anything like that. We can go through so many of them. But, one reason why this might be the case, when Harrison came to New York in the early 1900s, around 1905, he got involved in Black working class intellectual circles. They were lyceums of St. Benedict the Moor and St. Mark's Church on West 53rd Street, because he was still living in that area at the time, as was the majority of Black and Afro-Caribbean population. And it was a place where African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans would come together. Harrison referred to it as the germ of Black racial consciousness. And in the Lyceum, they would have, like we're having, they'd have discussions, speakers, and things like that. And you could agree or disagree. You could put forth your opinion. But afterwards, you go out and, get a cup of coffee with your friends. It was a healthy intellectual atmosphere. And Harrison retained that for the remainder of his life. But many people weren't used to that, and they would be stung by Harrison's criticisms. Are we okay, Kiana? Sorry if I talked too long, group.
It's okay.
No,
It's
no,
a pretty good
it's
question.
okay. It's very interesting.
How would, given this climate that we are in, this social, this political climate that we're in, Black Lives Matter and all of that, how do you see Hubert Harrison in this climate? How do you think he would be involved in what's happening around us?
Well, various ways. One, I think he would be out there involved in and organizing protests against all these. I mentioned he organized protests against East St. Louis, which was a big attack on the African-American population in East St. Louis. In 1919, there were attacks on the Black communities around the country, but particularly Chicago and Washington, and he called for armed self-defense. He came out to New Jersey, where I live, when the Klan was rising up in the 20s, and challenged them openly. So he would be putting out challenges. He would be arguing for armed self-defense. And that would be one thing he would be doing. But he'd also be writing and trying to explain what was going on. And he was clear that all this white supremacy was not in the interest of European American workers, although they might not know that and they might not believe that, and he would try and explain things. He wanted to preach racial unity. He'd try and bring people together. As a matter of fact, in his last years, his final organization was the International Colored Unity League, which is akin to, years later, to Malcolm's Organization of Afro-American Unity. We try and, it's a much more broadly unitary approach. So in answer to your question, I think he would be militantly opposing. He'd be trying to involve the masses. He'd be trying to educate and write and speak. Again, the two main means of mass communication he was masters of, the press and speaking on the street corners. I also want to say Harrison delivered 3 talks which were recorded on the radio back in the 1920s. And I cite them in volume 2. I've tried to track them, but I've not had any success yet. But I think they were probably archived in the Edison archives in New Jersey, where there's over 1 million unorganized items that are still there. But I look to the younger generation who know how to work through these things better to locate that stuff. And I also have a friend from St. Croix who said he actually saw, and he was sure he knew what he was talking about, 15 seconds of a video clip of Harrison speaking, because I've never seen one yet myself after all these years. There's Garvey, there's a few minutes or part of a minute or something of Garvey speaking and, things like that, but nothing of Harrison. But I haven't given up, so maybe people could come up with something.
Thank you, Dr. Perry. So we'll take one more question from Sequana.
Good afternoon, Dr. Perry. My question is, what interested you to choose Hubert Harrison as the central subject of your book?
Very good, thank you. Take 2 or 3 minutes on this. I was writing, I wanted to change the world, and I was writing on why no socialism in the US. And I was pretty convinced that white supremacy was the key stumbling block. It was what the ruling class relied on to maintain social control. And we had to take them head on that, because that's what they relied on. And so I had that clarity, I thought, and I was also clear that it was not in the interest, white supremacy, not only of Black people, but not only of poor European American working people, because they're getting crushed by it too, maybe not as bad, but they're getting hit by it. So I was writing on why no socialism, and that's what all these books started out to be about. And in the course of that work, I read J.A. Rogers, which was mentioned earlier. Richard B. Moore did a piece on Harrison, Encyclopedia of Negro America, or some such. And a fellow named Philip Foner is a labor historian. He had a chapter on Hubert Harrison. And I read those three things and I said, who is Hubert Harrison? So I went to the Schomburg Center. And back then, everything was on microfilm or microfiche. So I got Harrison's two books. I printed them out, took them home and read them. And as I read them, I stopped in my tracks, because he was the clearest thinker of all the early 20th century radicals on what I thought were the key issues, the centrality of the struggle against white supremacy. And I said, gee, I got to write about this guy. He's too important, because all this other talk is missing the main thing, and Harrison's got it. So I started writing on him, but I also, back then, I know it's going to sound odd, but I could type the same letter and change who it was going to. They had some machine back then, it was called. And I sent her about 35 emails out all over. And a librarian from St. Thomas writes back and she goes, I'm related to Harrison's family. And his son and daughter are alive in New Rochelle and in Harlem. She put me in touch with them. And that's when I went up and met them in 1980, 81, in that period. And I told them I was interested in writing on their dad. They looked at me. They were wondering why you want to write about my dad. I understood that. And second visit, I brought them 3 chapters. And the third visit, they took me to the front of this railroad flat apartment. They had preserved his papers since 1927, basically. They may have moved them once or twice. And they said, here, take these and do with these what you need to do. And I was overwhelmed. I was totally overwhelmed. But I felt a great responsibility then too. So that started me along the way. But in answer to your question, I was interested in radical social change. I thought Harrison was the clearest thinker of the early 20th century, just like I think Allen is one of the clearest thinkers of the later 20th century. And we all needed to know more about both. That was fine. Does it make sense? Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Amos.
So my question is, since you are not like a person of color, what inspired you like to go against white supremacists that you saw so much of a disjustice to Black people itself?
Very good question. But along the way, I became very clear that white supremacy was not in the interest of European Americans. I said early, my family was working class, and my family moved from the Bronx out to North Jersey. And the town I moved out to, Paramus, has shopping malls and things like that. And it grew from 6,000 to 25,000 in 9 years when I went out there, lily white. And, but that was by governmental design, because people moved into that community on something called the GI Bill, where you could get a house with 0 down payment and low interest loan. And the statistics for the New York, North Jersey area are 70,000 GI loans were awarded, and less than 100 went to families of color. See what I'm saying now? How this is by design. And it's not only New York, it's every city in the country. But it wasn't all that it was made up to be. For instance, where we moved was old farms, celery farms and things like this. And all the toxins in the soil remained. And my father, his job in a lily white union he was a pipe fitter, and they dealt with asbestos and fiberglass. And so my mom dies at 44 and my dad at 54, from all these things related to these so-called privileges. That's one aspect of it. But two, as a working person, I saw that we weren't getting any place. I did work in the workplace, and I saw when we came together on issues, we made much better advance and progress. I traveled a lot. I've lived since the late 40s in all my living relations with people of color, so I learned a little bit. But one other thing, this gets a little deeper, but this is related to the Allen work. Allen says the white race is a ruling class social control formation. And he did not define himself as white. He says, I'm human, and if you care to give me a name, I'm European American. And I'm pretty much of that same ilk. When they ask me to fill out these questionnaires and stuff, human, I'll stand up for it and buy it. And, that's it. I'm 75 almost now, and I've lived my life, and I'm living my life, and I want to live it as a human. And I realize there's much more, and it's not just simply saying you want to just change your name and stuff, but I try and oppose white supremacy every day, as best I can. And I got to ask, that Francis name, that comes up a lot in these books. You might have some relatives here, So dig deep.
Thank you, Dr. Perry. So we're seeing that Hubert Harrison may not be widely known, appreciated, celebrated, but here at WUVI, the University of the Virgin Islands, we are doing our part to inform the community on who Hubert Harrison was and what he did for us. Dr. Jeffrey Perry, we are honored. I know you said that you don't want to glorify yourself, but we are honored to have you and to have you sharing so much of your wealth of knowledge on Hubert Harrison and of yourself. So let's give him a big hand for joining us. Thank you so much for being with us today. And we wish that we had much more time with you. There's a lot to be said, a lot to be shared. Thank you again. I'll now turn right back over to Dr. Kahina. I'm not seeing.
Greetings, I'm here. I'm just quiet. I'm just very quiet because first and foremost, I want to just again echo the students. You all are awesome in terms of just presenting your inquiries, I wouldn't call it an interrogation, but definitely some very targeted inquiries to Dr. Jeffrey Perry. It's really important that since April 27th marks the anniversary of the birth of the Honorable Outstanding Virgin Islander Hubert Harrison, we know we have some other work to do. We started our month celebrating the Honorable Outstanding Virgin Islander and second elected governor of the Virgin Islands in the embodiment of Cyril Emmanuel King, this year being the centennial of his birth. And we know we have an actual code in the Virgin Islands law to acknowledge April 7th every year as Cyril Emmanuel King Day. So, and rightfully so, as we started on the 7th, here we're moving towards the 27th. This is another opportunity for the Virgin Islands to embrace the respectful acknowledgement of another outstanding Virgin Islander born in the late 1800s, again, here on II St. Croix, and in the embodiment of Hubert Harrison. And all the information that you all have brought forth is amazing, informative, targeted, to some a little controversial, well received. And Dr. Perry, we've had this conversation over and over again. We're looking forward to you being able to continue to share with us. You know, we've had interviews with you with WVI Radio and our radio stations. We've had the distance interviews. We've had the opportunity of having you share publications with our students as well as our faculty and administration here on at the University of the Virgin Islands. And we are very appreciative of you bringing so much information in such a short time, even though it took, as you said, the 40, 50 plus years, et cetera, but to be able to compartmentalize all of that information and to have the well wishes, the blessings, and the support of the family of Hubert Harrison, that speaks volumes to the layer of not only scholarship, not only the intellectual rigor, but the commitment that you have to ensuring that authenticity on the works, the contributions, and the achievements of Hubert Harrison are at the highest form. And for that, we're very grateful. I'm looking to see if my colleague who co-teaches this course with me,
Can
Professor
I just jump in and say one thing?
Of course.
I would love for our listening audience to please write this down: www.uvi.edu. Join up with UVI. We are here to inform you. We are here to keep you informed. Join our radio production class with Dr. Cooper. Join our communication classes. You will be richly informed at UVI. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful being in this class.
Give thanks. I'm curious if, I know what you're gonna say, Professor Cooper, but it's okay. Let's move that forward. Are you good? Okay, then fantastic. We're gonna close out. The silence is only because we have so much that has been shared. Want to give a round of applause again to Dr. Jeffrey Perry, our guest.
I want to just thank all the class participants and Dr. Kahina and Dr. Cooper. Great seeing you again. I haven't seen you for a while, Dr. Cooper. So this was wonderful today. I'm totally exhilarated by this. You know, it gives me much hope for the future. So thank you very much for what you're doing and what you've done.
And you have been listening to another live broadcast made possible by communication students at the University of the Virgin Islands through WUVI Radio, at the only historically Black college and university in the Caribbean and a land-grant institution. You've been given some websites. You can also look at WUVI Radio BI on various social media platforms. You can go to uvi.edu. Make it simple, uvi.edu. wuvi.edu. There's a number of options that you can utilize to just get more information if you'd like to be a part of this particular journey that facilitates communication, integrated with social media, a lot of passion, and honestly, a lot of work too. And we really want to commend the WVI radio production students for bringing this particular broadcast to you. And as we always say, keep that in mind, that while we're celebrating the anniversary of the birth of Hubert Harrison, culture heals humanity, land is our foundation, and spiritual harmony unifies us. There's a lot more to come. So let's give everyone a round of applause, and we look forward to the next broadcast.